There are three modes of training. And when we talk about training, we want to think about capacity. And the best way this was described to me is if you can think about your physical self as a bucket. And as you're pouring water into that bucket, you're only so full. And if you pour too much water in, it's going to start to overflow. When you exceed capacity, your self actually breaks down, whether it's physically, mentally, or emotionally. You're exceeding your capacity to handle the load, essentially. Okay, so when we're talking about training, we're really discussing the ability to grow that size of that bucket so that we can pour more into it. And that's what training is. It's expanding someone's capacity to handle more. Okay, so there's three different training modes. There's a physical, a mental, and an emotional mode. Now, doesn't matter what we're doing, what sport we're doing in life. When we're talking about the physical, mental, or emotional training mode, okay, there's some rules to getting that bucket to expand, to increase that capacity. So on the physical level, okay, the physical capacity that we're basically dealing with is our habits. So as an athlete, or anyone really, but as they become better on a physical level, but let's just think athletes, as an athlete improves, okay, their expertise, their mastery of their sport, those motor pathways become habits to the point where they don't have to think anymore, and the motions actually are reactionary. Okay? So everything that they're learning on a physical level is essentially trying to become a habit. That is the outcome that we're chasing. But to get to that outcome of habit, we have to kind of have some elements going through this. So if I say your name, and let's say someone says my name, Raleigh, okay, it's a habit that to hear my name, that I'm just going to look like, who said my name? It causes a response, a reactionary response. I don't even think about it, right? But to get to that point, I had to have culture. I had to have people around me who knew my name, used my name, and taught me it was important to listen for my name. So culture is how I was building the habit. Okay? This is a simple thing that you can use in your daily life where you say, okay, well, I want to make these physical changes about myself. Well, ask yourself, do you have people around you that already have the habit you are chasing? That's the culture. And the culture is actually driving towards intention. Okay? So the question would be is what is the intention? Okay? The reason why as a child I was taught my name and then I was praised when I paid attention to it is because the intention was that my parents wanted me to listen so that they could get more done with their life. They didn't want to have to chase me around the house or, around the park to try to get me to go back into the car, essentially. They just want to say my name and say, Raleigh, it's time to go. And I'm like, okay. So the intention is to make their life easier, essentially. But through that intention, that culture, they created a habit. And then that habit is now used and leveraged in many different ways. Okay, these rules, they're not broken. This is how it operates. So when you want to increase someone's physical capacity, you need to understand what is the intention we're chasing after. Is there a culture built around that intention? And then what's the habit that's going to be the outcome of this? Okay? And you can generally, there's a limit to this, but you generally can only build or expand habits kind of within degrees of themselves. You're not going to experience this massive growth in some habit that is not connected to any other prior learned habits. You're kind of using all your previously learned habits and collectively working with them together to build intention in this group of people to develop a new habit. And so they kind of morph out of each other. This is the physical side, physical training mode. Now if we get into the mental training mode, okay, this is more a risk-reward type of problem. On the mental side, it's a risk-reward. So the risk is, if I do this thing, what's the detriment to me? The reward being, if I do this thing, what do I get? What's the outcome? What's the significance of it? Okay? Which then leads us to the payout. So if someone says, Raleigh, do 100 push-ups for $1, not as interesting, but if someone says, I'll give you $100 for one push-up, okay, the payout is going to dictate a lot of what the risk reward is really asking. And so there's a payout attached to this, and the payout is going to determine really if I want to accept the risk reward. But with that comes perspective, because the moment you change the payout, you're really changing perspective. For instance, I could do 100 push-ups for $1 because I don't have $1. I could just change my perspective on it. And so part of the mental capacity is learning to change the perspective with the payout that's attached to the risk reward. You're going to start learning when you become more mentally strong that you can take on more risk reward because you understand how to switch and shift your perspective. And so when it comes to mental capacity, we're trying to grow that perspective essentially, but we're trying to grow the ability to take on and manage different risks and different rewards. And so we have to pursue perspective to get there. The last thing you could possibly want, and this has happened, is a student comes in and they're like, I can do a backflip, and you're just like, great, show me what it looks like. It's a huge risk, you know? And what's the reward? It's like you haven't seen what they're capable of. You don't even know if you can trust them. And so having the appropriate perspective to say, hey, can you first show me progression 1, then 2, then 3? I'm going to spot you maybe. Do a couple spotted so I can earn some trust and see if you're really ready. Understanding that it needs to start with perspective to see what that payout's going to actually be before we just take on the risk of the situation. And so that's the mental side. The emotional side deals with desire. It deals with essentially the pleasure senses that just go, I love chocolate ice cream. And so getting a person's attention is very easy. If I love chocolate ice cream and you say, hey, Raleigh, would you like a gallon of ice cream that's all chocolate in it? I'd be like, yes, absolutely. You don't even have to ask for it. Like, you could just say chocolate ice cream for free. And I'm like, where? I love this stuff, right? And so that's what desire does. It grabs our attention and it's already wired in us and no one has to convince us that it's a good idea. We just think it's a good idea, right? But the problem with desire is the distance of achieving it, which I call measuring essentially, okay? If the distance between getting the chocolate ice cream is like I gotta run a marathon, which goes back into kind of like risk reward, but if the distance of achieving that is too great, then I actually don't have any desire for it. And so a key point in understanding and working with somebody's desire is you have to make the measuring distance of them actually obtaining it something that's reasonable. So an example of this would be is if you had an incredibly disruptive class, and you said, if everybody pays attention to me, we all can jump into the foam pit. It's like they have a high desire to jump into the foam pit, but the chances of everyone paying attention to you all day long with the entire class are slim. They may not actually then think it's a reasonable outcome, which again goes back into risk reward, but you're basically cutting off the leveraging of their desire. So it needs to be very close. The reason why it needs to be close is because hope is one of the most powerful emotions that you're going to find in humans. You need to create hope in the process. And so by looking at this person's desire and putting their desire within inches of their achievability of like, oh, I can actually obtain this, you're actually increasing their ability to have hope for the future. And so those students that are like, I can't do this, and they just give up, and they're like, I quit, and I don't want to try, consider the fact that maybe what they really want just seems too far away. It's not attainable. And if it was obtainable, they'd stick around. And so that's the power that hope is going to have. And so that's growing people's emotional capacity. And so we do this in little micro moments, but an example would be is as you get better at it, you can run a marathon. It's like you start and then 26.2 miles later, you finish and you don't give up on mile 3, 4, 5, 6 because you have the hope to finish no matter how terrible the experience is. And so that hope can carry you through greater and greater experiences of essentially suffering, but leads you to greater and greater rewards as well. And so this is the power of expanding our capacity. So when we're talking about training somebody, we kind of need to ask the question, where is their deficit? Where are they plateauing? What do they actually need? Maybe somebody's physically strong, but they're emotionally weak. So how do we grow their emotional capacity? Maybe somebody's emotionally strong, but mentally weak. How do we grow their mental capacity? And so we can play this type of game. This happens more on an individual level at higher level gymnastics where the sport becomes more individualized. However, as a class, when we talked about reading the room, you might identify that your class just needs to get physically better or mentally better or emotionally better, and you might kind of tweak things to try to encourage and help everyone grow in that specific area. So I hope you learned something from the 3 training modes.